Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. This is one of our special podcasts that we are doing as we are on break, pre-recording, and we are stepping back from the news to offer you some recommendations on matters that will give you pleasure and succor and some sense of wonderment over the course of this long, hot summer in which our politics is going to get incredibly discouraging and America is going to fall into into a vast pit of despair. So, in order to stave off that despair, my fellow panelists and I are going to talk to you today about the works of science fiction that mean the most to us. Again, we are not talking about what we're not making a list of the best works of science fiction ever, rather the ones that speak the most to us. Obviously, science fiction, the genre that on the one hand can offer visionary clues to where civilization is going, and the ones that really do seem to have almost prophetic qualities to them. From Jules Verne onward, really maybe the first science fiction writer of serious vintage, Jules Verne, but going on from him, the novels that also managed to cast an interesting reflection on today by casting what we are going through into either a distant future or sometimes, though this is really more fantasy, a mythical past. So I'm going to be discussing this with my fellow commentarians here. Executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Matt, as a man who has read every Stephen King novel, who does not qualify as a science fiction writer, except maybe in a couple of books, you could maybe say that 1963 is a science fiction book. You could maybe say that Under the Dome is a science fiction book, but really not a writer of science fiction. But this just gives you cred in the genre reading community.
Thank you.
Okay, so where since you were the one who voted for science fiction today.
Well, yes, that's true. I gave two votes. It was really Abe who was the deciding vote for science fiction, but I'm more than happy to offer my recommendation. You know, it was the writer Terry Carr who once said that the golden age of science fiction is 12. And when I think about my love of science fiction, it is true. Most of it I consumed while I was a teenager, or even before becoming a teenager, a tween, as they say. So as I was going through the shelves last night, thinking about what I would recommend, I realized that to me, science fiction is really a short story genre. And when I think about the works of science fiction that still hold up now that I'm in my early 40s, the short story tends to be the form in which science fiction is best presented. And so I'm going to recommend an anthology. The anthology is called Masterpieces, the Best Science Fiction of the Century. It's edited by Orson Scott Card, the author best known for the Ender's Game series. And Ender's Game, of course, began as a short story / novella, pretty lengthy short story before he turned it into a novel. But this is a great anthology. It contains some of my favorite science fiction stories, among them Arthur C. Clarke's The 9 Billion Names of God, Harlan Ellison's Repent Harlequin, Said the Tick-Tock Man, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, a very haunting story. A fantastic kind of sci-fi / alternate history by the writer Harry Turtledove called The Road Not Taken. I highly recommend this story. It's a fantastic twist. And then one of my all-time favorites, which is part science fiction, part horror, but since it's in this anthology, I'll count as science fiction because Orson Scott Card considers it science fiction. And that is a long story, really a novella by George R.R. Martin, famous for A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series, called Sand Kings, which is it's kind of like kind of a story about pets that takes a very dark turn. So that's the anthology, Masterpieces, edited by Orson Scott Card. And I guarantee you, if you're up for this sort of literature, it will provide hours of really good reading.
It is really important that you mention this because really until the 1950s, in the United States, science fiction was almost exclusively a short story. There were these two magazines, one called Amazing Stories, and then John R. Campbell's Fantastic Fiction. I can't remember the name of it, but these two magazines, and they published as many did. Like the short story was almost a co-dominant form in the United States with the novel until the 1950s, and every great writer that you know of or that you can name from the mid-century wrote a lot of short stories. Philip Roth came to prominence as a short story writer. John Updike wrote more short stories, way more short stories than he wrote novels and all of that. Then somehow the short story began to fade. You didn't mention, I think, like the probably the single most famous, or the the most famous short story that really kind of inaugurated the genre, the modern genre, which is Nightfall by Isaac Asimov, which I imagine is in this anthology.
No, strangely, it's not. Well, maybe why I didn't mention it. But
maybe they don't have the rights.
Yeah, but it's in another anthology. There is another anthology I could also mention, which not only has Nightfall, but has another great story, which is not in here, called Hot House by Brian Aldiss, which is about a far, far future where essentially the Earth is a giant rainforest. But the Nightfall is an amazing story too.
Yeah, but in Asimov's The Martian Chronicles, which maybe is the first, not The Martian Chronicles, Foundation. Excuse me, the Foundation series, which I think is again itself is a kind of foundational work of American science fiction that took it to another level. Was all short. They're knitted together short stories that are set in, as we now say, the same universe. But anyway, that's a great recommendation.
What's most amazing? Yeah. What's most amazing about the short story stuff is that these writers got paid. I mean, this was their sort of day in, day out. They scrambled and wrote short stories and made some kind of living. I mean, they got paid for it. You can never put
They had to write a lot.
Like that.
They had to write a lot.
They're paid about a penny a word. Is my understanding.
Yeah, but and it's interesting because of all genres, it makes sense that science fiction should have focused on this, because often, if you try to read it now or whatever, and we're obviously older, and maybe this is not, again, it's a young man's game or something like that, but it's one really great idea, and a short story is a single crisis. The classic definition is it's the tale of a single crisis resolved. So, or a single thing that gets resolved, whereas a novel is a story about change over time. Science fiction is like a quick hit, a bombing.
It's also why pulp crime fiction was also the short stories were flourishing, because you have a case that you work out,
or murder mystery like they
Yeah. So there were murder magazines, Ellery Quinn's magazine, all sorts of things like that. All of these things don't exist anymore. Also because people don't read for pleasure in the same way that they used to. They read for pleasure the way that they watch Netflix, and there was a whole world of people who did that just doesn't do it anymore. It does other things, like plays video games about these matters rather than reading about them. So, Abe, what you got?
Okay, I chose Philip K. Dick's The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Whoa!
From 1964. Yeah, I don't. It's kind
of you're going difficult. You're going with difficult. Philip
it's almost too difficult to explain plot wise, but it came to mind for me because it was my first exposure to Philip K. Dick, actually, and I sort of didn't even know before I read him that science fiction could kind of go into these types of areas, or had gone into such type of areas. And the thing about Dick is that it's not the one idea here. For this he weaves together many ideas. It's about technology. This takes place in the future where the climate is heated up and man has inhabited all sorts of other planets. Fine, that's basic. And there's a drug that everyone is addicted to sort of ease the discomforts of, post Earth life and bad hot Earth life. And Dick plays around a lot with technologies that are almost would exist in a dream. So the drug, you take this drug and there's a little sort of like a play set with it, and you can sort of project yourself into the play set, and you can do it as a shared experience. And then there's an explorer there's rumors that he finds a competing drug. So the manufacturer of the first drug, they sort of go to war, and they go to war in this strange realm of, you don't know what's reality, you don't know what's not reality, because of all the drugs and the technology. And Dick also always had a very strange Gnostic religious obsession that I was first introduced to here. So there's a lot going on in this book, and it's funny. It's funny, and it's very out there, and the ending is ambiguous. But I heartily recommend it. It is deeply enjoyable. The ideas are strange and challenging in a good way to wrap your mind around. So that's the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Anybody else have a favorite Philip K. Dick that isn't? Because I have one. Interestingly enough, I think his most famous novel is one of his least good. The Man in the High Castle, which was made into this Netflix series and won him all these awards, and is one of the first alternate history books, like a book of what if the Nazis had won World War II, is right. The Japanese had won World War II and the Nazis, and it really, he has this a brilliant concept, and then he cannot finish it. He doesn't know how to end it properly. But he wrote a book called Time Out of Joint, and this is a book about an ordinary American living a totally ordinary life, and he suddenly, and this is where Dick's personal schizophrenia starts expressing itself in his writing, but he starts seeing weird flatness behind things as he's like riding on a bus or something. Rather than seeing a sign that says Coca-Cola, it says drink ad in white type, and it's like he starts seeing that things are two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional. Can't figure it out. He's living just an ordinary guy living an ordinary life, and Dick writes really, really well about mid-century American middle-class life, evoking its very banal, mundane qualities and marriages that aren't going that well and things like that. And then what it turns out is happening is that the government has figured out that this guy has a unique ability to figure out where alien America, the planet, is under assault, and he is playing a game, a newspaper lotto game, that he is supporting himself by playing, called Who Will Find the Little Green Men, which is sort of like Battleship. But it turns out that as he is filling out the game, and then he hands it in and he wins $10 every day, and so he keeps playing it, he is actually onto what the alien battle plan is, and that they have constructed this reality for him in order to get him to keep playing the game. And it is pretty amazing. And even like it's a pretty amazing piece of writing. And it's interesting because he is now, I think, people now think he is the greatest of all science fiction writers.
There's a really deeply weird book that he wrote that was based on his own mental health issues, his own institutionalization, splitting up from his wife, which is called The Clans of the Alphane Moon. It came out in the 60s, and it's basically like there's like an insect-like alien race that's taken over Earth because the humans lost, and the humans want to take over Earth again. But it's all about psychiatry, actually. Each of these different clans have different manias or schizophrenia or all the, but the core story is this is where Philip K. Dick used never marry a writer if you don't want to see your life, even in science fiction, on the page, because the whole goal of this is the main character wants named Chuck. He wants to kill his wife, so he's trying to find a way in this weird, post-apocalyptic context to kill his wife using an avatar. Anyway, it's a weird and not very well written book, and critics hated it. But some Philip K. Dick fans think it's the most honest portrayal of his own. He comes out the most on the page in this totally bizarre story. But
I mean, just one last thing about Dick is what makes him so different from others is that I don't know that he ever thought any of it was fiction.
No, he did, and then the obsessions that were behind his work.
And he had all sorts of mystical OCD experiences.
And then he really did go. I mean, he went.
He was institutionalized.
His last 3 or 4 books, which are barely even books, are kind of rambling visions. Writers have done this forever, right? I mean, it's from William Blake, or William Butler Yeats wrote A Vision, which is his own crackpot idea of how history works using the astrological table, and it's an insane book. And Dick was writing this too, but he really was a very sad case, because he was among the most talented writers of his generation, and was able, as I say, to write about. One of the reasons these books, these Flights of Fancy, are so amazing in his writing is that he writes about ordinary life so well. This is like Stephen King's great sauce, right? Is that, particularly when he was younger, is that he would evoke a town in Maine, and it was like you were living in this town in Maine that was totally ordinary, but full of its own tragedies and traumas and secrets and all of that. And then it would start moving into this uncanny direction, and so it was like it really could have been happening to you. And no one did that better than Philip K. Dick. My choice is one of the most exhilarating American pulp novels. It's called The Demolished Man, and it's by Alfred Bester. And it's a story of it's like Crime and Punishment or Leopold and Loeb, where a guy decides that he wants to commit a murder and get away with it. And he's a very rich industrialist, a middle-aged rich industrialist. And the trick is that there is a class of people living in the world who have telepathic abilities and can read other people's thoughts, and so there is no crime, because anyone who wants to commit a crime will instantly be read by the Esper squad, by the police, and be prevented from doing so. And so there's no point in trying to commit a crime. So like no crimes are being committed in the United States, and he sets out to try to figure out how he can do this. And the evocation of this very, very clever idea, right? Which is, I'm going to see if I can use my free will to best this complete obstruction of my ability to work my will on the world, with the portrait of what it's like to live as a person with ESP, and this whole society of people who barely even speak anymore because they can just communicate through thought together, and they sit around at parties kind of constructing word games in their heads, and no one is speaking, but you see the word games play out on paper. People have been trying to figure out how to make a movie out of this book for 70 years since it was first published. It is unfilmable because of the brilliance that Bester shows in depicting on the page what it would be like to live in this world of people who don't even really need to speak anymore. He was a very funny. He also wrote great short stories, Bester, and he was one of the few science fiction writers to live an entirely normal life, because he was an editor. He was like a magazine editor in New York, and he was an editor on Holiday Magazine, which was kind of like the original Travel and Leisure or something like that, a magazine about vacationing and stuff like that. And he was an editor, and he worked at an advertising agency, and he lived a conventional life whereas a lot of science fiction people really did end up living their lives in kind of weird
his prose is just amazing. I mean, it pops. It has this sheen, and the way he evokes color, I think, comes from his copywriting background. But his work is just incredible, just a delight.
And a second novel, a novel he wrote after this called "The Star's My Destination," which is about, and then, again, like, interesting because of the working out of an idea. What happens if some people start figuring out how to teleport? Suddenly you have some ability to move your body through space, and the incredible social dysfunction that is created by the fact that then, say, somebody can teleport himself into a woman's bedroom and rape her, so that women have to live in mazes, have to live in rooms and houses in mazes, because if you can't hit the spot exactly at the right time in the right place, your body will be kind of like sliced in half by a maze wall. And then this creation of a kind of neo-Victorian society as a result of that in which women have to be protected at all costs from men, and then a psychopathic prisoner guy who is figures out how to teleport himself over vast distances and then becomes a threat to human civilization. That's also a great book, but it's not the exhilaration of the Demolished Man. And that by the way gives me one more thought, and this is interesting because this was a book that was of vast interest to, of all people, Gertrude Himmelfarb. Neil Stephenson, who is maybe the most brilliant of the contemporary science fiction writers, but very self-indulgent. His books are thousands of pages long, sometimes very hard to get through, but he is really remarkable. Wrote a book called The Diamond Age, which is about what happens essentially when 3D printing, this is 30, 40 years ago, but what happens when basically things can, nanotechnology means that anything can be created out of nothing. And how basically society, again, is completely revolutionized because there's you could just sort of like order something up and it is created in front of you. So you no longer need technology, you no longer need workplaces, you no longer need borders, you no longer need countries, and that this world of purposelessness descends upon, and somebody commissions a manual, a Victorian style how-to manual that becomes a kind of way of living that is created again by a rich industrialist, sort of like in The Demolished Man, who was trying to figure out how to save his grandchildren from living an absolutely horrible life. And can you somehow reconstruct Victorian era morals when you need them, when that is the only way to save humanity from itself? And Bee was haunted by this book. She wrote a very brilliant essay. Frank Fukuyama wrote a pretty brilliant essay about this book. Bee wrote about it, and I don't think Stevenson is a conservative, and he's a libertarian, very libertarian. But if you're that's another kind of like remarkable. Ends bad. A lot of these some of these books really do end badly, and it ends pretty badly, but pretty striking. Okay, so what do we got?
I haven't done mine.
We
yet.
haven't. Christine,
you
hasn't
haven't.
Had hers.
Christine, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I don't matter. Okay, well, so
Jeez, I feel terrible.
You should feel terrible. You should feel
I
terrible.
do feel terrible.
So I was very glad that Matt made his pitch for the short story as the best genre for science fiction, because I completely agree. I actually bought that anthology that you recommended for my son. As many of our listeners know, one of my sons is an absolute science fiction fanatic. He's read everything. When I asked him for recommendations, the text I received in response was so long, I just was like, okay, I'm just going to go with a classic. So what I picked is obviously Ray Bradbury. Bradbury, who, he's a wonderful, wonderful science fiction writer. The edition I like of his short stories is a wonderful Everyman's Library edition, just called The Stories of Ray Bradbury. The excellent Christopher Buckley wrote the introduction to it. And one of the things about Bradbury that people forget is that even though he was paid pennies a word, he loved writing. Like, he saw it as a job, but it was a job he enjoyed. He grew up during the Depression. His parents couldn't afford to send him to college. He was self-educated via public libraries and the UCLA library, where he would rent a typewriter and churn out these stories for money, and was just delighted every time a check came in the mail telling him that he was a writer. Like, he never seemed to have lost the joy of being a professional writer, which I think for those of us who spend most of our time writing, it's a good reminder to remain optimistic about the craft. But this collection has all of the greats in it. Two of my favorites, The Happiness Machine and The Veldt. But almost every story in here is fantastic. Many of them are just a page and a half long, others a little bit longer. But he was able to do both straightforward science fiction, which we know from, Martian Chronicles, but also a kind of creepy human nature horror story, as we saw Fahrenheit 451 being a great example. But a lot of these books are about dread, what humans dread, and then he teases out where that dread emerges, what it comes from, what triggers it. So it's not all sunny and happy, but all of his stories, I think, come down to expressions and descriptions of parts of human nature. So in that sense, he's just, I would say he goes beyond science fiction writing in a lot of his work. But that's what I would recommend, the Everyman's Library edition of The Stories of Ray Bradbury.
Fun fact about Ray Bradbury is that, among other things, he was the author of the screenplay to the very creditable film version of Moby Dick, made by the director John Huston, starring Gregory Peck as Ahab. Maybe not the best casting, but really a very good movie, and a very surprising when you watch it, and it's like, screenplay by Ray Bradbury. You're like, what? Really?
He probably read. I mean, he read everything. Yeah. He was a true autodidact, and had probably had many thoughts on Moby Dick that even a literature professor wouldn't have come up with.
And also close friend of Russell Kirk's.
Yes, who himself was a
ghost writer, ghost story writer.
Ghost story writer. Yes. Friend of Russell Kirk's, a Reaganite, but there is a very serious conservative strain in science fiction. That has been totally purged. And now it's been purged
in the last decade.
Yes, that's a good point.
The greatest heights of the genre. It was the most conservative form of literature.
Yeah. Well, one interesting aspect of that is you mentioned Orson Scott Card as the editor of the anthology. And of course, Orson Scott Card, when finally they decided they were making a movie out of Ender's Game, which is also a remarkable science fiction novel about a 6-year-old genius who, sort of like the Philip K. Dick story, Time Out of Joint, ends up being the only person on the planet Earth who can figure out a battle plan to stave off an invasion from these insect-like creatures. And Orson Scott Card, of course, was one of the very, very early canceled people, canceled 15 years ago because he was opposed to he's a Mormon and opposed to gay marriage, and this assault on him for it. He gave money to Proposition 8, which was the anti-gay marriage proposition in California, but they came like a house of bricks. They came down on him. And if you read the Ender's Game novels, they are not only are they not right-wing, they are the great twist in Ender's Game is that the America, let's say, destroys this alien civilization due to a complete cultural misunderstanding of what the alien civilization was doing and was about, and that it actually had no imperial designs on the planet Earth, but that we were unable to discern their intent, and committed Ender has to live through his life in other books dealing with the fact that he was the author of an unintended genocide, which I would not say in the years that the movie was coming out was a message that would have been unpleasant or uncomfortable to the left in Hollywood, which might have thought that this was an allegory about the Gulf War or about the war in Iraq or something like that, because his politics are very complicated. But he was like, that was the moment at which it became clear that science fiction was no longer gonna get the kind of pass that it did before. It was pretty amazing to see. And yeah, now who wants to read it? Because if you write anything, it's all sort of, trans.
And Neal Stephenson, you're right about him. He's got to slim those books down. His novel Snow Crash is one of my favorites, and one that I read as an adult, and it's a very good book about virtual reality, among other things. Yeah. But it's 400 pages. That's fine.
And that's a short book for him.
That's what I'm saying. His other novels, his more recent novels, they're like 1,000 pages. Don't have the time, Neal. Slim it down. Slim it down.
And that's what the short story is, right?
It's
kind of a weird reversal of where we come in, which is the quick hit you get in and you get out. And Neal Stephenson, needs an editor. But he is, it's like if you took him and you read his books, you would say that he was probably the most brilliant American novelist now writing. He writes about the dawn of the scientific age. It's a series of novels called the Baroque Quartet, which are about Isaac Newton and Hooker, the people who built the scientific world of the 17th century, set in London. The evocation of London is unbelievable. But yeah, it's a lot. Man, it's a lot. Okay, well, so we've got, because I was interrupted by my own solipsism, Christine's collected stories of Ray Bradbury is it the Library of America edition?
It's the Everyman's Library edition. Yeah.
Okay. And your anthology, Matt, is called
Masterpieces, edited by Orson Scott Card.
Abe, you're the Three Stigmata of
Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick.
And mine is The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. So thanks for listening. Enjoy reading. We'll be back with more. For Abe, Christine, and Matt, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.